The following is a Hoop Ball presentation. Welcome to the Fantasy NBA Today podcast.
I got no beef today. Neil, I got no beef. I'm beefless. Feels great. Do you have any beef?
I do not. I'm happy to be here. One day from the draft.
You haven't brought beef to this podcast yet. Your day will come, though. Your day will come. I can see the rage boiling up inside of you.
Yeah,
No?
that's my personality.
Yeah.
I can just load up here. Don't I?
Yeah, Neil's all about rage. Dan Besbris, Neil Rochlani, welcome to Fantasy NBA Today. It is your Thursday edition, draft day morning, which means nothing to me, but it means something to a lot of people. And, you know, the Lakers acquired a second-round pick, so I guess that's something I'll have to take note of for our Lakers pod. But I am, as I've said before, very much on the outside looking in. Neil, I'm looking forward to listening to tomorrow's episode of this show because I'm not on it, and you and Adrian are going to break down the draft after it happens. But what are your thoughts going into it, honestly? And then I'll we'll get into the thick of things on today's podcast, but like, what are you even looking for? I've heard that I watch Twitter. That's as much as I know. I've heard that there are a lot of question marks in the lottery and a lot of teams that have no idea who's going to be off the board in front of them.
Yeah, that's what I've read as well, is that there's a lot of really good talent and a lot of guys go to different places. I think my biggest takeaway so far is I'm really shocked that Doncic is not going to go 1 or maybe even 2.
Who are the other guys at the top?
Ayton's projected to go 1 to Phoenix, and then Bagley's supposed to go to Sacramento. At least that's like the public information. Who knows what's really going on? But I think Ayton's almost a done deal. I'm just surprised because every expert I listen to that I really respect about talent evaluation, which obviously I am not an expert in talent evaluation, says that Doncic is the most talented draftee since Anthony Davis. So why he's not going to go 1 is shocking to me. So we'll see how he ends up in the NBA. But that's really my big takeaway is I don't know why teams are not going to try their best to get up to 1 and take him.
So, you know, what is it about these guys at the top that makes them so interchangeable? Why is this year so different? Why isn't there a Karl Anthony Towns or an Anthony Davis that's just sitting there as the obvious selection? Is it just that there are more outstanding talent? Because I've heard that this is a relatively good draft, and it's not like, you know, the Anthony Bennett fiasco where no one really wanted a top pick that year.
Yeah, I think they're all going to play out better than Anthony Bennett. That's sort of the projection.
So play at all is what you're saying?
There's a lot. Yeah, there's a lot. There's like 5 big men that are not, I wouldn't say interchangeable, but they all sort of had the potential to be really good starters, maybe at the All-Star level. And then there's a lot of wing players that are also good too. And then I'm sure you're familiar with the point guard Trae Young and Colin Sexton and then the guy from Kentucky. So there's a lot of guys that are projected to be at least role players, if not starters, and then maybe all-stars. So we'll see how it plays out. I'm most curious about Chicago since I live out here, and I'm not sure who they're going to take. And like you said, it's probably about who falls to them. The most intriguing player is probably Michael Porter Jr., who is injured right now, but may have the most talent, raw talent. So we'll see.
Yeah, I'd heard that was another thing that I read. But again, my knowledge of any of this is very limited. I did see that people feel like this Porter kid has an unbelievable ceiling, but they have no idea if he's going to be able to stay healthy. Now, Doncic is someone, of all the guys in the draft, he's the one that I actually have any idea about. I actually looked him up a little bit, wanted to learn a little bit more. He does seem like a pretty sweet potential player. Is it Euro bias? Is that what's driving him down the draft board, or is there something else?
I have no idea because there's so much tape now. There's so much information about these players, and they play with former NCAA stars that could make it to the NBA, but they're still very good players, and he dominated against them, and even in like the EuroLeague championship. So, or whatever, I'm probably messing that up, but in a tournament there against NBA players. He did fantastically well. I don't know what the bias is, except the only knock I can hear on him is that his athleticism may not be enough for the NBA, which I am surprised. I think he's going to be an all-star. That's my take. At least that's my one deep thought.
He sounds like just the kind of guy that the Sacramento Kings would usually take. I don't know enough about any of these dudes to give a good idea on them, but boy, historically, that's like Kings written all over it. They've had a long run of European-born NBA players, and they just they brought in Bogdanovic last year, who's turned out to be a solid NBAer as well. But whatever. I mean, you guys, listen, I should back my way out of this conversation as quickly and as quietly as possible so I don't completely embarrass myself. Again, we will not have necessarily what you'd call live coverage in any podcast form, but Adrian and Neil will have the Friday episode of Fantasy NBA Today. They'll break it all down, talk about draft picks, your thoughts, your feelings on where guys end up, and more. Again, that'll be on tomorrow's episode of this show, which I just told you is, again, Fantasy NBA Today. I am Dan Besbris. He is Neil Rochlani. At Dan Besbris, at Ball with Neil on Twitter, at Hoopball Fantasy, at Hoopball Tweets, and as I mentioned on yesterday's pod, please do check out at Hoopball Lakers. We put out a podcast late on Tuesday night. That was opportunity for finally the three of us to get together and record that bad boy just on the whole LeBron James, Kawhi Leonard stuff. It's just looking more and more positive for Laker fans. Not necessarily that everything's all going to come together perfectly, but all these weird little factoids are pointing in LA's direction, and it sort of looks like it's coming down to the Lakers and the Clippers in the ultimate grudge match for Southern California. They'll be playing in the same stadium either way, but we'll see how all of that shakes out. That, again, is at Hoopball Lakers. You can check out that most recent podcast there via YouTube, Facebook, whatever. It is every place. We continue our tour of the Eastern Conference. We continue our tour of the NBA. We have but 2 teams remaining. The last team, we're going to do this like Miss America, and I'm going to let you guys know the runner-up, because if you want to call it that, to today's show. Tomorrow's show, Adrian and Neil will be covering the Brooklyn Nets, who just got themselves Dwight Howard. That's tomorrow's show, which means, Neil, you and I today, we're going north of the border, the Great White North, Toronto, the Raptors, hamstrung by massive salaries, but you can't really call it that when you're the number 1 team in an entire conference, can you? I mean, what if LeBron James leaves the East? The fortunes could change so rapidly.
Yeah, what an interesting season they had, right? They had that great season with the 65 wins, I believe, and they beat some very good teams on the road, not just beating up on the East, and then they get to LeBron and they get trashed. So it doesn't look like they're going to do any, like you said, they have salaries tied up, so they're not going to do any wholesale changes. They're kind of stuck with their top guys. I don't know how the morale is going to be. That's the one thing I guess I'll wonder about is, will they come back and be able to play as hard? So I know last year they really focused on transitioning their team to more of a three-point shooting team, and kind of changing their offense around to get it so the ball doesn't stick so much. And they had to work really hard to do that. And I'm just wondering, after getting swept by the Cavs, losing those first 2 at home, will they have sort of like the drive to get even better? So we'll see.
Yeah, I mean, they obviously with the coaching change, I know these postmortems are really about what happened during the season, but that coaching change happened very quickly after they were eliminated from the playoffs. So we almost have to talk about it. Dwayne Casey has now already been hired by the Detroit Pistons. The Raptors, I believe, is that Nick Nurse? Is that his full name? I might be getting the name wrong.
No, you have it right. That's it.
I knew Nurse because in my mind, it's like, okay, his last name is a profession. And then I think I remembered Nick because it was alliterative. But they brought him in. I mean, maybe you could argue that a coaching change will give them a little bit of a pep in their step. I think they can feel pretty confident that without wholesale changes, they're going to be in decent position in the playoffs. I don't know if they're going to be able to stay in front of Boston getting Gordon Hayward back, or Philly, depending on how good they get, but those 3 teams are probably going to be the 3 best teams in the Eastern Conference, unless LeBron surprises us all and goes to some other destination out east. So to that end, they could bust their humps to try to get home court advantage, and they have shown themselves to be a vastly superior home team. They were good on the road at 25-16. They were absurd at home, tying the Rockets for the best home record in the NBA at 34-7 at the Air Canada Centre. 40-12 in conference play, 12-4, by the way, against their division, which has the Celtics and the 76ers in it. Yes, there's also the Knicks and the Nets, which, beat up on those cats however you like. But overall, like you said, Neil, really a strong season for the Raptors. They went way over their season win total. This was an easy one. 48.5 was the win total. They won 51. I got to read this, Neil, and then I want your thoughts on where you see them heading from a win-loss perspective. But what I wrote about the Raptors at the beginning of the season was I could cut and paste a Spurs write-up here. They won 51 games last year. Despite Kyle Lowry missing 20, they had Serge Ibaka for only the last 25. There's sort of no reason to think Toronto gets worse. PJ Tucker is gone. He was only with the team for the final 45 days of that year anyway. The main core is there. They feel slighted by Boston, and they'll be angry. And all of those things were spot on. That was one of my best write-ups. It was one of my best picks. I feel good about that. And they clobbered the number. There was just, I don't know why people felt the Raptors would actually drop in wins. My only thought was, somebody expected them to lose all 4 games of the 76ers and not pick up wins against anyone else, or maybe they thought they were going to be dinged up throughout the season. I just don't know. Why would that number be adjusted down for this year? It's inconceivable. For next year, Neil, after the number being 48.5 and them hitting 59 in wins on the season, I've got to imagine their season win total number is going to be somewhere in between those two, like a 55, 54.5, 55.5, something in that neck of the woods. Where do you see their season win total heading for next year?
Well, I was going to say 55, but you just said that. So,
you can agree. It's fine. I mean, this we're degenerates. It's okay if two degenerates think alike.
Well, thank you for that. Yeah, I have to say they come down a little bit only because of the I think Boston will be more full strength. Philadelphia's probably going to be better. Indiana might be a little bit better. We'll see what happens with Cleveland. The East might get a little more competitive. I don't know. So I think maybe they lose a couple more games. Maybe they don't have that same drive as last year. So I would say they're a couple off this season's pace, but I don't think they'll be much different in terms of talent. It'll just be how much will the adjustment to the new coaching situation be. So
Toronto Raptors, from a salary perspective, have, by all accounts, more money tied up for this coming season than the season that just ended, which seems like an insane thing to put on paper. It is, by the way, contingent on Bebe Nogueira getting a deal as a restricted free agent, which he probably won't. Let's be honest. They can afford to let something slide. But with a normal salary adjustment slotted in for Bebe, their salary as a team goes up by almost $10 million season over season. Norman Powell is a big reason why. He's due a large salary increase coming into next year. He signed, I believe, a 4-year deal. Kyle Lowry makes $2 million more than the previous season. Ibaka, Jonas Valanciunas each make $1 million more than the previous year, so that's another $4 million in the bank. Basically nothing comes off the books for the Raptors. Neil and I were talking about this just before going on air. They had a team salary of $117 million this year, which, believe it or not, doesn't even really put them in the top half of the league. They're middle of the pack with that number, but it's going up to $126 million next year. And yes, they could let Bebe go, and that drops $3 million off of that number. But there's no openings for this team. Kyle Lowry, $31 million. DeMar DeRozan, $28 million. Ibaka, $22. Valanciunas, $16. CJ Miles, $8. Powell, $9. And then just a cavalry of guys in that $2 to $3 million range. Jakob Poeltl, OG Anunoby, Delon Wright, Malachi Richardson, Pascal Siakam, Justin Hamilton is on that list. Freddie VanVleet, by the way, officially not signed for the following year, although I'm sure they'll try to work on that in some capacity. I mean, we talked about them being sort of hamstrung. They almost have no choice but to try to get fired up for this coming season. I am, like you, Neil, slightly concerned that saying we have to get fired up is a lot easier than actually doing it. What can they do? This is a hard question, but we're going to try to solve it. What can Toronto do? Maybe it's from an X's and O's standpoint. I don't know. Maybe it's something else. What can they do as an organization, as a team, to get excited about next year? Or is it almost entirely dependent on where LeBron James ends up?
Well, if LeBron James is in the West, I think they'll be very excited. That'll probably be enough just to fire him up. Yeah, what can they do? When I look at their roster this year and trying to see how things might play out differently next year, I guess Van Fleet could have a bigger role. He proved that he was pretty good in the second unit. And then I think it's Jakob Poeltl who could have a bigger role too if Ibaka is going to be coming out more and also taking some minutes away from Valanciunas. I don't know if that's enough. That youthfulness will get them more energy and maybe infectious. That's the main thing I can see is if you get younger guys who are really out there playing hard, maybe that'll motivate the older guys too. I just have to imagine Lowry and DeRozan have to be deflated after last season.
Yeah, certainly did seem that way. DeMar DeRozan, by the way, to his credit, he was one of the guys that did kind of change his game a little bit. Serge Ibaka seems to be a bit on the downslope. Every year it's the Jonas Valanciunas coming out party, and every year it's the same old story. But we'll get into that on the fantasy side in just a moment. I do kind of want to transition with one interesting thought. And I mentioned it on the Tuesday edition of this podcast when Adrian and I got together and we were talking about what the Boston Celtics was the team we covered on Tuesday. And the question that came up was, this team, the Boston, legitimately had 7 guys that all need to be doing something. Is there a way to have 7 players on the same team with fantasy value? And the closest thing we saw this year to that was probably the Toronto Raptors. And I know everybody wants to go to the Rockets or the Warriors or someone with a little bit more flash, but you could almost argue that Toronto was the team who had the most fantasy-relevant players at some point during the year. Kyle Lowry, DeMar DeRozan, Jonas Valanciunas, Serge Ibaka are sort of the obvious ones. By midseason, it seemed like Fred VanVleet was going to be a part of that mix. Delon Wright became a part of that mix. Jakob Poeltl became a part of that mix. And then maybe you could throw a bone to a guy like CJ Miles if you were chasing threes, but obviously over the entire season, his numbers didn't cut it. But that's a lot of players. That was 8 guys I just listed, which to me kind of puts them as the lead dog in what team had the most options at any given time. But doesn't that also tell you that all of these guys had another gear that they maybe could have gone to instead of these other dudes playing more, right? Like Toronto made such a conscious effort to dial back their starters' minutes that it meant more guys had value, but their starters never really hit the high point that everybody wanted them to. What does that trade-off mean to you, Neil, as a fantasy guy moving towards next year?
Well, I expect to be more like last year. I think they had to sort of reduce the minutes of Lowry and DeRozan, and not have them go into the playoffs injured. So I think that'll be a conscious effort again this year, and we might even see a decrease by 1 or 2 minutes from Lowry if Van Fleet can play a little bit more. So he's sort of my biggest question mark. Can I get into Kyle Lowry real quick?
Yeah, man, absolutely. Let's do it.
I want to ask you a question. Over the last 5 seasons, how many times do you think he did not play 70 games or more?
I feel like this year was the first time he finally got to 70. Is that right?
No, he's only been under 70 once in the last 5 years.
See, that's a really good stat. It's really been more about when as opposed to how many, right? It's usually just been the last 4 weeks of the year.
Exactly. I mean, he's been playing over 70 games for 4 out of 5 years, and he has that stigma of the guy you can't trust in terms of the injury, right? People kind of avoid him, which is pretty much false if you look over the entire season. So he's my biggest question mark because last year when I'm looking at where he finished overall, in terms of averages for an 8-cat, he was 27th on the player rater. And I'm looking at his numbers. He had 3 3-pointers, which might be a little high, but everything else seems pretty much in line. He only took 12 shots. So I think he can replicate that next year. And I have to see how healthy he is going through the season, but I think he could be a decent early third round option.
Yeah, I almost feel like there's room for growth there, although maybe it's just the minutes being down, right? He played 5 fewer minutes per game this year than the previous season. That's like 15%, and it translated, right? Like he was 15% down in a lot of statistical categories year over year. The scoring was actually down more like 30%, but steals were down about 20 to 30%. Rebounds were up somehow. Didn't see that one coming. Assists were basically the same. Steals, scoring, shot attempts, field goal percent was down, but it was actually much closer to his career mark. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. In fact, I might even argue that there might even be room for improvement for Kyle, because that was like the least he's been forced to do since 2012. Is it possible that next year he comes back and says, all right, let me reassert myself? I kind of like Kyle Lowry moving forward. Is that the point you were making? Did I roll with it, or am I going the wrong way here?
That's what I'm still trying to figure out. I don't know my hesitation is that he has a very good capable backup, and I don't think Lowry, as he gets older, is going to want to play more minutes. Maybe you're right. Maybe he does come back and say, hey, I need to assert myself more, take more shots. Get back, into the 20s where he was scoring before. I don't know how it plays out. If I'm him, I'm thinking I'm going to want to just play. I don't think I'm going to go up in minutes. If anything, I might want to go down a minute or two, just because of his age. So I'm a little worried about it. So I'm probably going in the opposite direction, although I think his stats will hold about the same, is what I'm basically coming to. My main point is that I don't think he's an injury risk, which I think a lot of people think he is.
Yeah, especially if he's down at 30 to 32 minutes per game. I mean, that changes things. The calculus on that is so different than when he's grinding out. He was at 37 minutes a game the previous 2 years. I mean, that was a significant drop off. The 32 minutes per game, that's like I said before, it's the lowest since 2012. It basically would have been his lowest almost of his career since he's been a starter. You go back to 2009 and just that 1 year where he was coming in a little bit lower. Yeah, I mean, 16.2 points per game. I don't know that he gets back into the 20s, but let's say he has a better shooting year. He was at 42.7, which is right on his career mark. It didn't really increase the number of three-pointers he was taking all that much. That change came from the other guys on the team. His free throw number was down a lot. So you could probably argue either he wasn't as good at getting contact, he didn't get as many whistles, or he just didn't do it as much. So were his non-three-pointers farther away from the bucket? These are the things that you kind of have to roll all into a ball. But all of that together, and now I'll give you quickly on the 9-cat side, he was number 29. So, yeah, slight underperformance. He was probably drafted more in that, 20 to 25 range. But, missing by a half round on a dude that played 78 games this year. By totals, by the way, he was number 18 in 9-cat format. By all accounts, he ended up being a pretty decent pick, one that I thought was going to completely ruin my 30-deep team, and then I ended up making the conference finals in that. So, thank you, Kyle Lowry. I think people are still going to be, like you said, concerned with him based on sort of a stat that's not really there outside of that 1 year. So I think he might fall, and I think he might be a really safe mid to late 20s pick if he falls that far. So I don't have really much problem with Kyle Lowry. What about DeMar DeRozan, though? Right? He changed his game. Everything was different this year. He moved away from the bucket. He passed the ball more. And then at the end of it all, he was basically the same dude. He's a top 45 fantasy player. It's a weird give and take with him where it ends up in the same spot anyway. So isn't that kind of a good thing, though, that we just sort of know DeMar DeRozan is going to be a safe end of 4th, early 5th round pick?
Yeah, I think he's very trustworthy. The only issue I have with him is it's tough for me to take shooting guards that don't really shoot three-pointers. And he still was only at 1.1 last year, unless I'm...
No, you're right. Yeah, that's a career best, too.
I thought I had maybe typed that in wrong, but which for the way the league's going, if you have only 1.1 from your starting shooting guard, you're really gonna have to make it up somewhere else. And I do want to mention I remember your rant about Kyle Lowry at the beginning of the season when you had to get him.
Yeah, I couldn't believe it.
You went on a walk or something and you came back and it was auto picked or something.
No, dude,
like
it was overnight. It was overnight.
Okay.
It was the first pick in the morning. So the guy before me who hadn't picked, I'm still so mad about it, and I don't remember who it was. I don't have any beef with the human in particular, but just the way that his schedule like stuck it in my craw. I had sat in that 30 deep draft room for like 8 hours before the overnight kicked in. I think I had it open on my computer from like 4 p.m. until 11 p.m. or whenever it shut off. And it was sitting on the dude in front of me the whole time because this was like the pre-draft draft. And I went to bed and I thought, all right, I'm in pretty good shape. And I woke up in the morning and like by the time I had taken the kid and the dog around the block, my turn had gone. It was Actually, you know what? That wasn't the entire story. I'll go back and I'll listen to it to verify this, but I'm pretty sure it still wasn't my turn when I woke up in the morning, and I checked, and then I walked away for like 45 minutes, and when I came back, the person in front of me finally made their pick, and then it rolled right through my 45 minutes while I was gone. I couldn't believe it, and then he ended up being totally fine, so, sorry, everybody. It was still, you want to make your pick, man. That's my first round pick in 30 deep, and I probably wouldn't have taken him. And there was probably someone on the board that would have been a better selection anyway. It didn't kill me the way I thought it would. All right, rant done. Re-rant. That was a re-rant.
Yeah, that's when I think I really was drawn to you with that rant. That's when I first was like, this guy is entertaining to listen to. All right, so DeMar DeRozan, 47th and ACAT by averages, nearly 34 minutes. Yeah, it's just that 1.13 pointers again is what I struggle with, and he did get up to 23 points on 17.7 shots. So I don't know if that can go any higher. And so I'm worried that his points might come down a little bit, and I don't see where he's going to grow in any other category unless he does really improve the 3-point shooting and takes a lot more. But he seems to be more of a mid-range guy, so I'm not too confident there unless we see something new and in preseason and stuff like that where they're talking about him shooting more from the 3.
Yeah, I'm not even sure that I want him shooting that much more from 3. He's a career 28%er from downtown. He shot 31% from that range this year. He's just not a good 3-point shooter, and every time he adds a 3-pointer to his overall shot selection, his field goal percent is going to take a hit. If you take the 3-pointers out this year, he really had an outstanding shooting year. I think he was like 7 for 14. I think he shot 50% from 2 this season, but 31% from 3. So you knock those out, and suddenly you have a high-volume field goal percent helper as your shooting guard guy. That's worthwhile. I actually think the 1.13s driving the field goal percentage down, I didn't like that trade-off because, frankly, you can go out and you can scoop up a 3-point shooter in like a Joe Ingles or a Nico Mirotic, guys that we were grabbing around 100, 115 to make up for whatever you're not getting from someone else. And so, DeMar, if you're listening, don't worry about it, man. Just go shoot 50% from inside the arc and everybody will be cool with you. Everything else, feels pretty sustainable. He'll be a top 50 guy. That's just where he is. He'll probably never crack the top 35. He'll probably never fall below like 58. Very predictable, very safe, but you know what? There's actually something not awful about predictable and safe for another guy that's played 74 games or more in 5 of the last 6 years. So that's another kind of check mark on the right side of the ledger, and his totals value this year was better than his per-game value, much like Kyle Lowry, because they're working so hard on keeping the minutes down for the starters. So it was probably a net gain. But like you said, Neil, I agree with you. I don't think that he takes 3 to 4 more shots per game. I think the 17 to 18 is probably where he's going to end up, barring some large change in Toronto. And I don't know. I feel like he'll be available. I don't much care for points, but I do like really predictable guys in these kind of late, early rounds before I start really value hunting. So I don't know. I'm okay with him. I'm the same I was with DeMar last year at this time.
Well, what's a late early round for you?
Like the let's call it like the 40 to 70 range. If you can get guys in there that are actually going to give you the value around what you're picking, I'm totally cool with that.
Yeah, same.
Yeah.
All right. What do you think about Ibaka?
Yeah, let's talk about some of these other clunkos.
Yeah, he's the other one that's supposed to be part of the big three, I guess, but not really anymore.
Yeah, he's the wet end of the big three. Serge Ibaka, 9 cap, by the way. He was number 78 is what I think I have here. That's not very good. He was probably worse than that in 8 cap because his turnovers were really low.
A 77 by averages, so not any different.
So no different at all. Interesting. 12.6 points per game, 6.3 rebounds, 1.4 3-pointers, just under an assist, half a steal, and 1.3 blocks. 48% shooting from the field, 80. We'll round up. We'll give you the benefit of the doubt, Serge. 80% at the free throw line, which was slightly better than his career mark, but pretty much in line with where he's been since a couple of really bad, very early seasons. The 48% shooting was back up where he had been prior to a very poor shooting run with Toronto at the end of the previous year. The 3-pointers is kind of where he's been for about 2 to 2.5 seasons in a row now. I mean, this has just been this slow and steady decline for Ibaka, and the 1.3 blocks per game was the worst of his entire career. So I am not excited about him magically turning that category around. It's been a straight arrow down for 7 consecutive years. That's just not really a trend that tends to reverse itself.
Yeah, the big one for me is the minutes, down to 27.5 per game.
Good point.
Typically, I don't like drafting guys that are getting less than 30 unless they're like a specialist. I'm a big sort of minutes guy, so I am worried that might even go down further with, is it Podol or Portal?
Jakob Poeltl.
Yeah. I mean, he was 18.6, and he did show that he could play like the pick and roll really well with Lowry, so maybe he gets more minutes in there. I think Ibaka might be at the top. He was 77 last year, so I think he's going to drop because I think his minutes will go down. And like you said, the blocks were sort of his specialty, and they keep going down. I don't see him scoring more, even though when he took 10 shots last year, and his rebounds are only at 6. So.
Yeah, and they've never been that great. Like he had one year in Oklahoma City where he was a pretty good rebounder, and that's kind of it. Looking over at his entire career arc, yeah, you got to like what a guy like Jakob Poeltl has brought to the table. I want to mention Pascal Siakam in that same vein. He was really solid. He played 81 games for the Raps this year, 7 points, 4.5 boards, a steal, half a block. I mean, he came in there and he stole a lot of Ibaka's minutes by just playing really long, rangy defense. And they, not that he's a great shooter or an offensive threat, but they used him to defend in pick and roll sets against teams that went small, and he is able to handle it. So, yeah, I mean, Ibaka, I actually traded for him this year. I traded Derek Favors when Rudy Gobert was out, and I got Ibaka, and I still feel okay about that move, although, to Favors' credit, he ended up playing better the second time Gobert came back than I think any of us really expected. I don't know that I'd make that move again going forward, because another year of decline out of Ibaka, if he's top 80 right now, if you want to say top 75 this year, and he's been dropping about a round every year for 4 years in a row, that's going to put him sitting right around top 90, top 95 next season. That's not... I don't think he'll fall that far because he still has kind of a glamorous name for all the blocks that he put up in the past. So I'm doubting I end up with almost any Serge Ibaka anywhere. I wouldn't say, Neil, to completely avoid him because, what if he falls to like 115, 120? Then, yeah, you pick him up because, hell, he's still Serge Ibaka. But do you see him falling that far? I don't.
No, you're right. I mean, when his name rhymes with block, it's tough to people forget that. So
yeah, but Jakob Poeltl's name rhymes with turtle. Why don't people remember that? That's equally exciting.
Yes, fair enough. Yeah, he has that reputation that he built. And you know what? I made a trade for him last year, too, that I, in retrospect, would not have made again. And I think I was susceptible to the name and saw his stats were down a little bit and thought, you know what? This guy's going to rebound. He's going to get back up into the stats. He's got that potential still. And
well, he did a little bit, right?
He did a little bit, but he never really, I thought he could get back up to like more like in the 50s range, right? And he never jumped back that high. So, I agree, though. I think his name's going to be much bigger than his value. So we'll see where he falls.
What about JV? by all accounts, he actually put up pretty good numbers this year, considering he only played 22 minutes. But 22 minutes, that's brutal.
Yeah, I can't draft a guy at 22 minutes who's not doing that great on stats. I mean, he gives you good percentages for a big guy, but that's really it. I mean, I guess he had 8 rebounds, which is pretty strong for 22 minutes. Other than that, though, he doesn't really add much value. He did finish 66 though on averages, so above Ibaka, even though playing 5 minutes less. I'm worried that those young guys in the front court, I forgot about Siakam, and along with Portal, is going to get more minutes. So I think he's going to be on the decline as well in terms of time on the court.
You know why I think Valanciunas may have bottomed out in the minutes this year? And this is just a guess. Things may continue to get worse for him. But he started to add the three-pointer. Took basically the first threes of his entire career this year by all accounts. I think he went like 1 for 2 or 2 for 4 or something like that over his first 5 years in the NBA. And then this year he attempted 77 of them, I think, was the total number. And he made a little under half of those. If he can actually start to stretch the floor a little bit on the offensive side, they can utilize him. He played better defense this year, I thought, than in seasons past, maybe because he was out there for fewer minutes, so he could sort of rev it up in that kind of, almost like a bench role, but as a starter. Hey, just go hard for like 8 minutes here in the first quarter and 3 or 4 minutes somewhere in the middle of the second quarter, and we're gonna run you out there for most of the third, but then you're probably not going to play the fourth because that's when we really need to lock in on defense, and you're too big and slow. But I don't know how he falls below 22 minutes because Jakob Poeltl looks like an interesting young basketball player, but there's still kind of that growth curve where he is unable to create for himself in a way that Valanciunas kind of can with post activity. And Valanciunas is a very good free throw shooter where Jakob Poeltl is not. I'm inclined to think that they end up in almost a timeshare like it was this last season, more towards the end of the year, where Poeltl was playing 15 to 20 minutes instead of a handful, and Valanciunas was sitting right in that, low to mid 20s with, by the way, it's worth mentioning, he actually played 30 some odd minutes in a number of playoff games. So it's possible that they were also trying to kind of keep him in decent shape for the postseason. It does seem hard, though, and then I'm going to stop talking about JV because I keep kind of going back and forth on this. Field goal percent, free throw percent, that all seems sustainable to me. The blocks were a pretty high mark for him compared to what he had done. So I don't know if that is something he replicates next year. The assists were higher. His rebounding rate was really good. Maybe he can replicate that, but, like you said, man, top 60, top 70 value in only 22 minutes. You're asking for a lot, and it can fall apart in a heartbeat. I would look for him, Neil, to draft Valanciunas in the 90 range. I think if he falls that far, I would take a look at him because he is still kind of safe in his percentages, doesn't hurt you, points and rebounds kind of thing. But he feels like another guy like Ibaka that has just been decent for so long and has been, breakout candidate for so long that people end up scooping him up earlier than that.
Yeah, he's had some pretty solid seasons before, so he does, I think, have that recognition of being a guy who can be like a low-end starter on your fantasy team. I agree with you in that I would take him like around 100. The 22 minutes, I also agree. I don't know. Maybe it can't go much lower. Maybe you're right about that. I just don't know if it's going to get any better. That's my main concern. And 8.5 rebounds in 22 minutes. Maybe that's sustainable. That just seems high to me. So,
yeah, he gets in there and he rebounds like a monster. Man, for so many years we've watched JV and thought, why can't he just play like this every night on those like 1 out of every 15 games where he just is an absolute beast? But that, of course, is what separates these middling guys from the dudes at the top of the heap. So it goes. All right, I want to lump the bench unit into one kind of cluster, and I'd like for you to tell me where we should look with it. I mean, would you consider drafting any of the following 5 players at any point in a draft? Any point, would you draft them? Delon Wright, Fred VanVleet, Jakob Poeltl, Pascal Siakam, CJ Miles. Would any of those dudes end up on your team at the end of draft night?
You mean like in a 12-team league?
Yeah, standard 12-team, 13, 14 rounds, something like that.
No.
Not even Freddie VanVleet?
No, unless I hear he's going to get a lot more minutes. No, I don't think so. I'd rather get someone who is high risk, high reward, because I end up dropping usually my bottom 3 or 4 draft picks. They don't work out right away. And so I'm not going to draft someone who's going to have low minutes. So probably not on my team.
Yeah, I'm actually inclined to agree with you because as well as Freddie VanVleet played for the Raptors, and he had some stretches where he was just awesome. Efficient, knocking down 3-4 3-pointers a game at a high clip, scoring. He was passing a little bit. His numbers didn't really bear out the impact he was having on the basketball court, which I think is kind of the point, Neil, that you were making, is that the minutes weren't really there. And even when things were going really well for VanVleet, it was like 12, 13 points, 2 3-pointers, not a ton of steals, couple of assists. There just sort of wasn't enough meat on the bone. He was a better reality player than he was a fantasy player. What about Jakob Poeltl? Is it, again, the minutes situation with him? I mean, like, these guys were Delon Wright, same kind of thing, 20 to 22 minutes, just not enough?
Yeah, unless I hear different as I start to follow teams in the offseason as they get ready for next year. Unless I hear like someone's going to get a lot more minutes, probably not. I will have all these guys on my watch list, of course. But, yeah, just looking at like the rankings last year, like VanVleet at 20 minutes a game was like 180 and ACAT, which, like you said, he had some better nights. Over his average of 1.4 3-pointers, but it still wasn't spectacular. I think he'd have to get close to 30 minutes for me to really pick him up. And maybe Poeltl or Siakam, if they got like mid-20s, could be a guy, but I don't think starting out the season they're going to be there. So
yeah, Poeltl really needs, if he could get to 24, I think he'd be a standard league value. He could probably be a top 100 guy in 24 minutes. He had a stretch from a little before the All-Star break to the end of the season. It's, what is it about? Probably about 30 to 40% of the year, where he played 20 minutes a game, averaged 7 and 5, with 0.7 steals, 1.4 blocks, and he did it on 69% shooting, which all sounds really good, but the complete lack of any popcorn numbers, that's also a relevant stat, right? Like, we don't focus too hard on those, but this left him in that top 125 range. But, maybe another year under his belt, 4 more minutes. Could you say a potential 20% jump on every category? No, but you could probably argue a 20% bump in minutes would translate to a 20% bump in points and rebounds. And then you suddenly got a guy who's, 9 and 6 instead of 7 and 5, 0.8 steals, 1.5 blocks. If the 69% field goal percent holds, then you're talking about a top 100 asset. Then you're talking about a guy you could take at the end of a draft. But, Neil, I think you make a really good point. Unless one of these guys gets up into that 26, 27 range, it's going to be really hard for them to hold consistent value because Poeltl's really the only guy in that bunch that has the fantasy game where he could jump a few rounds pretty quickly because of the steals, because of the blocks, because of the massive percentages. If you add a little bit here and there to someone like that, they move up quick. Whereas with Fred VanVleet, there's going to need to be a volume increase for him for it to be kind of a significant bump. This, by the way, was with him playing 23 minutes per game. He was a top 125 guy. So, I think you're spot on, Neil. He probably needs to get to 27, 28 minutes to crack the top 100, top 90. I don't know that there's a way he gets any higher. Pascal Siakam, same issue. He just doesn't really have a fantasy stat set. And Delon Wright, too many flashes with him. For me, it's an inconsistency thing. VanVleet seemed to pass him in the pecking order, and that makes it tough. Maybe they play closer games. I don't know. That's my last question on the Raptors, Neil, is, they had a stretch this year where it was something like 20 days where the starters played in the fourth quarter one time. It was like one time out of 8 games or something like that. So, these numbers are actually kind of artificially inflated for the bench unit because they had half a month, 2/3 of a month, where they were playing an extra 5 or 6 minutes a game in a kind of a non-traditional setting. Yeah, the ceiling just isn't really there. And I got yelled at on this podcast a couple times for being a little bit down on the Toronto bench mob, but a lot of it was because I didn't think blowouts were sustainable. It's really hard to blow teams out every single night, especially if you're not as laser-focused as the Raptors were this year. So, yes, I agree with you, Neil. Tough to draft any of those guys. For me, my top pick would be Pirtle. Who's your top pick of that group? Is it also Jakob?
Yeah, it's the same. Well, him or Siakam. I have to see how they're going to look in training camp. But yes, one of those two guys. Probably Portal if I had to pick today. We didn't talk about one starter who really didn't put up any fantasy numbers. What about OG Anunoby? I guess that's the.
Yeah, is that your answer? He was wasn't he like the second worst fantasy player on the team?
He might have been the worst fantasy starter. I mean, starting NBA player fantasy stats.
Yeah, that's possible because he only averaged, what was his minutes total this year? Like 18? 20. It was 20.
Not a starter's minutes for sure, and not many stats.
He was, of any Raptors that played more than 20 games this year, he was the third worst. Just ahead of Bebe Nogueira and Norman Powell, by the way. Norman Powell, the worst fantasy player on the Raptors. I called that one. I'm tooting my own horn because other fantasy sites were high on Norman Powell, and I said, this dude doesn't have any fantasy game. He's all athleticism, but no steals, blocks, minimal threes, doesn't shoot the ball well. I don't know why everybody was getting so freaking jazzed up about Norman Powell. I feel good about that one. Nail on the head. He was the worst fantasy player on the entire Raptors roster. A roster, by the way, that included OG Anunoby, who we just mentioned a moment ago. CJ Miles, Pascal Siakam, Jakob Poeltl, Van Fleet, Wright, Ibaka, Valanciunas, DeRozan, Lowry, all better fantasy players than OG Anunoby. So, yes, my answer to your question is a hearty laugh and a turning of the page. That's all I got.
Yeah, well, that's a lot of players.
Yeah.
No more thoughts. Me on Toronto. I was going to say as we wrap this up, I know we're very short on to the draft, but there are so many propositional bets. Have you thought about that?
No, put them out there, man. Put them out. I'm going to sit quietly here for a minute. Educate me.
Can I tell you a crazy story? And I don't even know how accurate this is, but today I was listening to at Beating the Books podcast.
Ah, my boy.
Yeah, your boy. And he gave out Grayson Allen going in the first round, plus 120. When I went to look at it in the afternoon, it was minus 200.
Wow. The Gil Alexander bump.
I know. Isn't that crazy? So that was one pick. The other one I saw was, Luka Doncic going 2 or 1 was plus 200. So I guess people don't need to get picked first or second. Anyway, there are about a dozen prop bets that I see on my site. So I don't know if that'll spur you next year to get more interested in the draft. I'm trying to find ways to get you talking about it more.
I can't. It's just like my brain is at maximum, not capacity, because I'll continue to add NBA thoughts into the mix. But to me, the ROI on draft stuff just isn't high enough for me. I need, like, with the NBA during the season, everything I do, I feel like it brings me one massive step closer to a win. And with the draft, it's just like, okay, well, now what? So no, I don't think it's ever going to get me. What I will do though is, Neil, if you have a really good prop bet, you can tell me about it, and then I'll go bet it.
I don't have a good one, unfortunately. By the time I looked at the lines, they've already been like moved so much. So,
by the way, everybody should listen to Beating the Book. We can plug that on this program. His name is Gil Alexander. He hosts a Beating the Book podcast. He's also he hosts the Numbers Game on VSiN, which I am on during the NBA season every Tuesday morning. So you can catch me on that program as well. Good friend of mine from over in our pregame days. Fellow broadcaster turned degenerate gambler turned broadcasting degenerate gambler. Good dude. Gil Alexander is the name. You can find him at Beating the Book on Twitter. Neil, I think we've covered it, man. I think we've hit every angle on this Raptors thing, except for the very last one. And this is the emotional side. I want to see the Raptors succeed so badly. They're like my secret love in the NBA. I am so sad at the end of every season that they just keep getting completely stomped by LeBron James. When will it end, Neil? Please tell me something good.
I'm with you, but it's almost like they go in thinking they're going to lose, right? And then they just do, unfortunately, to Cleveland every year. I root for them as well, and I hope they do well. I think if Cleveland or if LeBron goes to LA, obviously that'll help a lot. I don't know what's going to happen though. I really see Boston and Philly as the two top teams in the East next year if LeBron leaves. So I'm not sure they'll get back to the conference finals.
That's a hell of a division. That is a hell of a division. The three top teams in the East, and two of the three just getting better. He is Neil Rochlani. I am Dan Besbris. This was your Thursday edition of Fantasy NBA Today. Neil and Adrian will have draft results tomorrow. You're going to want to check that one out. That'll be coming out first thing Friday morning. Have a lovely Thursday. Enjoy the draft. I'm sure we'll be tweeting away at Hoopball Fantasy, by the way. We'll have every single draft pick tweeted out as it happens in any of trades and good stuff that occurs during or leading up to the draft as well. The Panda Man and Aaron Brewski, they'll be on the case for that one, far as I know. Again, you can follow us on Twitter at Dan Besbris, at Ball with Neil. For a second and last time, have a lovely Thursday. We'll talk to you tomorrow.
This has been a Hoop Ball presentation.